Ex-husband brings mistress to reunion to shame ex-wife, but she arrived with the president. Distinguished viewers, welcome to Luxury True Life Stories. Please like and subscribe for more amazing real-life luxury stories. Now, let's get into the story. Mara Elliott grew up in a quiet town where life moved slowly, but expectations were clear and unyielding. Her father, a disciplined literature professor, believed that words had the power to shape not just thoughts, but destinies. He often spent evenings discussing stories, breaking down characters and their choices as if they were real people whose lives held lessons worth studying. Her mother, on the other hand, was a nurse who carried both exhaustion and compassion in equal measure. She worked long hours, often returning home late, yet never failed to remind Mara that resilience was built through action, not comfort. Together, they created an environment where excuses were not entertained, and effort was the only acceptable path forward. From an early age, Mara understood that her life would not be defined by chance. There were no luxuries in her home, no shortcuts offered, and no safety net beyond the values her parents instilled in her. She spent long hours studying at the dining table, often under dim lighting when electricity flickered, yet she never complained. Instead, she learned to adapt. She found focus in silence, strength in routine, and purpose in discipline. While other children dreamed loudly of future success, Mara quietly prepared for it. She did not seek attention, nor did she compare herself to others. Her mindset was simple: if she worked harder than yesterday, she was already moving forward. As she grew older, her habits became her identity. In school, she wasn't the loudest or the most socially dominant, but she was dependable. Teachers respected her consistency, and classmates turned to her for help, knowing she would never fail them. Outside of school, she worked part-time at a small bookstore, where she developed a deep understanding of people. She observed how different individuals approached life, some chasing recognition, others avoiding responsibility, and a few quietly building something meaningful. Those observations shaped her perspective. Mara didn't just want success, she wanted a life that was steady, earned, and undeniable. By the time she entered university, she had already made a decision that would guide her for years. She would build a future no one could take from her, no matter the cost. David Jones grew up in a world very different from Mara's, not poor, but never enough to satisfy him. His family lived comfortably, yet he always felt surrounded by limitations. His father worked in middle management, steady but unremarkable, while his mother constantly reminded him to be realistic about life. But David rejected that word early. To him, being realistic meant accepting mediocrity, and he refused to do that. He didn't just want success, he wanted recognition, power, and a life that placed him above others. Even as a teenager, he paid close attention to how influential people carried themselves, how they spoke, how they were treated. He studied not books, but status. In school, David was sharp, confident, and socially magnetic. He knew how to make people like him, and more importantly, how to make them useful. He built connections effortlessly, always aligning himself with those who could elevate his position. While others focused on grades alone, David focused on visibility. He joined clubs, led projects, and made sure his name was always in the right conversations. Beneath his charm, however, was a calculating mind. He believed relationships were investments, and every interaction had value if handled correctly. Unlike Mara, who sought purpose, David sought advantage. By the time he entered university, David had refined his vision of success. He wasn't interested in slow progress, he wanted acceleration. He chose his field not out of passion, but for opportunity, targeting industries where influence and money intersected. He observed the wealthy, learned their patterns, and mimicked their confidence. In his mind, life was a ladder, and every person was either a step upward or a distraction. He promised himself one thing: he would never be ordinary. No matter what it took, no matter who he had to outgrow, David Jones would rise, and when he did, the world would notice. Mara Elliott and David Jones met on a day that neither of them initially considered important. It was during a competitive university internship selection event, one of those structured gatherings where ambition filled the air and everyone tried to appear more confident than they truly felt. Mara had arrived early, as usual, seated quietly with her notes, reviewing details and preparing herself mentally. She wasn't nervous, but she believed in being ready. Across the room, David arrived later than most, walking in with effortless confidence, scanning the crowd not with uncertainty, but with assessment. Where others saw competition, he saw opportunity. Their paths crossed during a group discussion exercise. Mara spoke with clarity, offering well-structured ideas that reflected depth and thought. She didn't interrupt others or try to dominate the conversation, yet when she spoke, people listened. David noticed that immediately. He had seen many intelligent people before, but Mara was different. She wasn't trying to impress anyone, and that made her stand out more than those who were. When David spoke, his tone carried authority, his words sharp and persuasive. He knew how to steer conversations, how to subtly position himself as a leader without appearing forceful. Their interaction was brief, but it was enough to leave an impression on both sides. After the session, David approached her, not out of curiosity alone, but because he recognized value. Mara, in contrast, responded politely but cautiously. She wasn't easily drawn in by confidence or charm. Their conversation was simple, about the exercise, their goals, and their perspectives, but beneath it was something unspoken. David was intrigued by her composure, while Mara noticed the ambition behind his confidence. Neither of them knew it at the time, but that moment marked the beginning of something that would shape both their lives, something powerful, complicated, and ultimately, transformative. After their first meeting, David made a deliberate effort to stay connected to Mara. What began as casual conversations after lectures slowly turned into longer discussions, about goals, ideas, and the future they both envisioned, though from very different perspectives. Mara appreciated his confidence and clarity. He seemed driven, focused, and unafraid to chase big opportunities. David, on the other hand, found Mara refreshing. She wasn't impressed by surface-level success, and that challenged him in a way he wasn't used to. He had met many people who admired ambition, but Mara questioned it. She wanted to understand the purpose behind it. That difference created a balance between them, one that felt both exciting and grounding. As time passed, their connection deepened naturally. They began studying together, sharing meals, and spending long evenings talking about life beyond university. Mara opened up about her family, her disciplined upbringing, and her desire to build something meaningful. David listened, but he interpreted her dreams through his own lens. He saw potential, not just in her, but in what they could become together. He admired her stability, her intelligence, and the way she brought calm into his otherwise restless mind. For the first time, David felt something that resembled emotional attachment, though he still viewed the future as something to conquer rather than something to share. Eventually, their bond evolved into a relationship. It was intense in its own way, built on mutual respect, attraction, and a shared belief that they were both destined for more. Mara supported David wholeheartedly, encouraging him, helping him stay focused, and believing in his potential even when he doubted himself. But quietly, without fully realizing it, she began to give more than she received. David was present, but always partially, his mind often drifting toward the next opportunity, the next step upward. Mara noticed it, but she chose patience. She believed that love required understanding, and that with time, they would grow into something stronger together. Their relationship progressed quickly, and before long, what once felt like a growing connection turned into a commitment that seemed unshakable. David proposed in a way that reflected exactly who he was, confident, calculated, and impressive. It wasn't overly emotional, but it was grand enough to leave an impact. Mara said yes, not because of the spectacle, but because she believed in what they had built together. To her, it felt like the natural next step in a journey that had been steadily unfolding. To David, it was also strategic. Mara represented stability, intelligence, and the kind of partner that complemented his rising ambitions. Their wedding became a symbol of success in the eyes of others. Friends, colleagues, and acquaintances admired them as a couple that had it all: beauty, intelligence, and a future filled with promise. The ceremony was elegant, carefully planned, and filled with people who spoke about how perfect they were for each other. Mara stood beside David with quiet confidence, believing she was stepping into a life built on partnership and growth. David stood beside her with pride, seeing not just a wife, but a reflection of the image he was building for himself. Everything looked flawless from the outside, and for a while, even Mara believed it completely. But beneath the surface, subtle changes began to form. As David's career started gaining momentum, his priorities shifted. He became more focused, more distant, and increasingly consumed by his work and social positioning. Mara remained supportive, adjusting her own pace to accommodate his growing demands, but the balance between them slowly tilted. Conversations became shorter, shared moments became rare, and emotional connection began to fade into routine. Still, Mara held on to hope. She believed that this was just a phase, that once things settled, they would find their way back to each other. What she didn't realize was that for David, this wasn't a phase. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change everything. Ruth Johnson did not enter David's life by accident. She entered with precision. She was introduced at a high-level corporate networking event, one designed for individuals who understood that influence was built as much through presence as through performance. Ruth stood out immediately, not because she demanded attention, but because she controlled it. She carried herself with quiet confidence, dressed with calculated elegance, and spoke only when necessary, but when she did, people listened. Unlike many in the room, she wasn't trying to prove herself. She already believed she belonged, and that belief made others accept it too. David noticed her almost instantly. She represented something he valued deeply: refinement, strategy, and alignment with the kind of world he wanted to dominate. When they were introduced, their conversation flowed effortlessly, but beneath it was something sharper. Ruth was observant. She quickly recognized David's ambition, his hunger to rise, and the subtle impatience that drove him. She understood people like him well, men who wanted more than they had, and were willing to adjust their lives to get it. Instead of being impressed, she was interested. To Ruth, David wasn't just a man, he was potential. Their interactions increased after that first meeting. What began as professional conversations soon became more frequent and more personal. Ruth challenged David in ways Mara never did, not emotionally, but strategically. She spoke about influence, positioning, and the importance of being seen in the right circles. She encouraged him to think bigger, move faster, and stop limiting himself to what was comfortable. David found that intoxicating. Around Ruth, he felt like he was accelerating, evolving into the version of himself he always imagined. And slowly, almost without resistance, he began to spend more time in that world, one where ambition wasn't balanced by care, but fueled by it. The shift in David was not sudden, it unfolded gradually, almost quietly, until it became impossible to ignore. At first, it was small things. Late nights that were once explained turned into vague responses. Conversations that once flowed became brief and distracted. Mara noticed it not through what he said, but through what he stopped saying. There were fewer shared thoughts, fewer moments of genuine presence. When she spoke, he listened, but only partially, as if his mind was always somewhere else. It wasn't coldness yet, it was absence, and that absence began to grow. Mara tried to understand it in the only way she knew how, with patience. She told herself that David was under pressure, that his career demanded more of him now, that this was a temporary phase. She adjusted, giving him space, supporting him quietly, hoping that the distance would eventually close. But deep down, something felt different. She could sense that this wasn't just about work. There was a change in his energy, in the way he carried himself, in the subtle confidence that now felt detached rather than shared. It was as if he was building a life that no longer included her in the same way. The doubt settled slowly, but once it did, it stayed. Mara began to question things she had never questioned before, not out of insecurity, but out of awareness. She noticed how often his phone stayed just out of reach, how his schedule became less transparent, how his explanations lacked the clarity they once had. Still, she didn't confront him immediately. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she observed, waited, and held on to a quiet hope that she was wrong. But the more she paid attention, the clearer it became. Something had changed, and whatever it was pulling David further away from her, step by step. The truth did not arrive with chaos. It revealed itself in a quiet, undeniable moment. Mara had not been searching for evidence, nor had she allowed suspicion to turn into desperation. But clarity has a way of appearing when it is least expected. One evening, while organizing documents on David's laptop at his request, a message notification appeared, brief, but enough. It wasn't just the words, but the familiarity behind them. There was an ease, an intimacy that did not belong to casual conversation. Mara paused, not reacting immediately, but reading just enough to understand what she had already begun to feel. In that moment, the doubt she had carried silently turned into certainty. When David returned home, Mara did not raise her voice or create a scene. She approached him with calm precision, asking a simple question that carried the weight of everything she had discovered. At first, David tried to dismiss it, offering incomplete explanations, avoiding direct answers. But Mara did not argue. She simply held her ground, her silence demanding honesty more than any accusation could. Eventually, David stopped deflecting. There was no dramatic confession, no visible regret. Instead, there was something colder, Acceptance. He admitted the truth, not with shame, but with a sense of inevitability, as if what had happened was just another step in his evolution. What hurt Mara the most was not just the betrayal, but the absence of remorse. David spoke about growth, about change, about how people outgrow situations that no longer align with who they are becoming. To him, it was logical. To Mara, it was devastating. She had built their life on loyalty, on patience, on belief, and now she stood facing a reality where those things no longer held value to him. Yet even in that moment, she did not break outwardly. She listened, she processed, and she understood one thing clearly: this was not something she could fix, and more importantly, it was not something she should accept. The end of their marriage did not come with chaos, but with a heavy, undeniable finality. After the truth had been spoken, there was nothing left to protect. The conversations that followed were not emotional in the way Mara once imagined they might be. They were measured, almost clinical. David spoke about moving forward, about not wanting to remain in something that no longer fit his direction. Mara listened, not because she agreed, but because she needed clarity, not confusion. She did not beg, she did not argue, and she did not try to hold onto something that had already been let go. In that quiet strength, she made a decision that would define her. She chose dignity over desperation. The legal process that followed was just as controlled. There were no dramatic disputes, no prolonged battles over possessions or status. Mara did not fight for what she could claim. She focused on what she needed: freedom, closure, and the ability to rebuild without lingering ties. To outsiders, it seemed like a clean separation, almost too smooth for something so significant. But beneath that surface was a depth of emotion that Mara carried silently. She was not untouched by the loss, she felt it deeply, but she refused to let it define her. Every document signed, every agreement finalized, was not just the end of a marriage, but the beginning of a separation from a version of herself that had given too much without receiving enough. When it was over, Mara left not just a relationship, but a life she had once believed in completely. She walked away without looking back, not because it didn't matter, but because she understood that looking back would only delay what needed to come next. There was pain, yes, but there was also clarity. For the first time in a long time, her path was entirely her own again. And though she did not yet know what that path would lead to, she knew one thing with certainty: whatever she built from this point forward would be stronger, because it would be built on truth, not illusion. Mara Elliott arrived in a new city with no intention of recreating her past. She chose a place where no one knew her story, where her name carried no expectations, and where she could move forward without being defined by what she had lost. The city was larger, faster, and less forgiving than the quiet structure she had grown up with, but that was exactly what she needed. There was no comfort in familiarity, only opportunity in anonymity. She found a modest apartment, simple, functional, and entirely hers. For the first time in years, every decision she made belonged solely to her, and that independence, though quiet, felt powerful. Rebuilding was not easy, but it was steady. Mara approached her new life the same way she had approached everything before, with discipline and intention. She secured a position in a consulting firm, not the most prestigious, but one that allowed her to grow and prove herself again. She worked long hours, not to escape her past, but to invest in her future. Unlike before, she no longer shaped her choices around someone else's ambitions. She focused on her own progress, her own stability, her own goals. Slowly, her confidence returned, not loud or visible, but firm and unshakable beneath the surface. Outside of work, Mara rebuilt herself in smaller ways. She created routines that centered her, spent time understanding what she truly wanted, and allowed herself moments of stillness she had once ignored. The pain of her past did not disappear overnight, but it no longer controlled her. It became something she carried with awareness, not weight. She no longer questioned her worth or her decisions. Instead, she grew more certain of who she was becoming. This was not just a new chapter, it was a new foundation, one built with clarity, strength, and a quiet determination that nothing would shake again. The day Mara met Michael Nathan did not begin with anything unusual. It was structured like most of her days, early, focused, and purposeful. She had been assigned to assist on a high-level policy consulting project, one that required precision, discretion, and attention to detail. The meeting location was heavily secured, far more than anything she had previously experienced, and that alone signaled the importance of the work. Mara did not ask questions. She prepared, reviewed her materials, and walked in with the same quiet confidence she carried into every professional setting. To her, It was just another opportunity to prove herself. Michael Nathan, however, was not just another client. As president, his presence carried a weight that filled the room without effort. He was composed, observant, and deliberate in every movement. Unlike others in power, he did not speak unnecessarily. When he did, his words were clear, direct, and purposeful. Mara noticed this immediately, not as admiration, but as recognition. He was someone who valued substance over noise, and that aligned with everything she believed in. During the discussion, Mara contributed thoughtfully, offering insights that were both practical and well-reasoned. She did not try to impress, but her clarity stood out in a room where many tried too hard. What caught Michael's attention was not just her intelligence, but her presence. She was calm under pressure, unshaken by the environment, and focused entirely on the work rather than the significance of who was in the room. After the meeting, while others lingered in quiet awe, Mara gathered her materials and prepared to leave, as if the moment required nothing more than professionalism. It was then that Michael spoke to her directly, not with authority, but with genuine interest. Their conversation was brief, centered on the project, but there was something distinct in it, mutual respect, unspoken but clear. Neither of them lingered on it, yet both understood, in their own way, that this meeting was not as ordinary as it appeared. After their first meeting, Mara expected nothing more than professional distance. But Michael Nathan was not someone who ignored what interested him. Over the following weeks, her name appeared again, assigned to additional consultations connected to his office. Each interaction remained formal, structured around work, yet there was a subtle shift neither of them addressed openly. Michael asked for her input more directly, not out of authority, but because he valued how she thought. Mara, in return, remained composed, never overstepping, never seeking attention, yet consistently delivering insight that was precise and grounded. Their conversations gradually extended beyond strict agendas. It began with small moments, brief exchanges after meetings, questions that were not entirely tied to the project, pauses that lingered a little longer than necessary. Michael was a man surrounded by noise, by people who often spoke to impress or to gain favor. Mara was different. She spoke only when she had something meaningful to say, and that quiet restraint made her presence stand out. For the first time in a long while, Michael found himself engaged not as a leader managing responsibilities, but as a person having a genuine conversation. And Mara, though cautious, began to notice that with him, she did not feel the need to guard herself the way she once had. Trust did not form quickly, but it formed steadily. There were no grand gestures, no rushed emotions, no declarations of anything beyond what was clear. Instead, there was consistency. Michael respected her boundaries, and Mara respected the weight of his position. What grew between them was not built on intensity, but on understanding. They learned each other through conversation, through shared perspectives, and through the quiet recognition that neither of them needed to prove anything. It was unfamiliar, yet steady, a connection that did not demand, did not rush, but simply grew stronger with time. What developed between Mara Elliott and Michael Nathan was not something either of them rushed into, but once it became clear, it was undeniable. Their connection had grown through patience, mutual respect, and a shared understanding of what truly mattered. There was no confusion, no imbalance, and no need for validation from the outside world. Michael, a man who had spent most of his life surrounded by calculated alliances and public expectations, recognized something rare in Mara, genuine presence without agenda. Mara, in turn, found in Michael a stability she had never experienced before, not because of his position, but because of who he was beneath it. The decision to marry came quietly, without spectacle. It was not driven by impulse or emotion alone, but by clarity. Both understood the complications that came with his position. A public relationship would invite scrutiny, speculation, and unnecessary pressure, things neither of them wanted to define what they had built. So they chose privacy. The ceremony was small, almost invisible to the world, attended only by a trusted few who understood the importance of discretion. There were no grand announcements, no public celebration, just a quiet commitment sealed with certainty. It was not about being seen, it was about being real. Afterward, their lives continued outwardly unchanged, but internally, everything was different. Mara remained grounded in her work and independence, never allowing her identity to be overshadowed by Michael's role. Michael, despite the demands of leadership, carried a quiet sense of fulfillment that few ever saw. Their marriage was not built on display, but on trust, something steady, protected, and deeply personal. It was a new beginning, not marked by noise, but by a calm certainty that what they had chosen was right, and that for the first time, Mara's life was aligned not just with strength, but with peace. While Mara was building a life rooted in quiet strength, David Jones was moving in the opposite direction, into a world defined by visibility, influence, and image. His career had accelerated rapidly, placing him in elite circles where recognition mattered as much as results. With Ruth Johnson by his side, he appeared unstoppable. Together, they formed a partnership that was less about emotion and more about strategy. Ruth understood how to navigate high society, how to position herself and David in rooms that mattered, and how to turn connections into leverage. She was not just his companion, she was an asset, and David valued that deeply. Their public image was polished to perfection. They attended high-profile events, built relationships with influential figures, and ensured their presence was always noticed. Ruth's elegance complemented David's ambition, creating a dynamic that others admired, even envied. But beneath that polished surface was something more calculated. Their connection lacked the depth of genuine partnership. It was built on shared goals rather than shared understanding. Still, to David, that didn't matter. He wasn't looking for emotional balance, he was focused on expansion. Every move he made, every appearance, every connection was part of a larger plan to solidify his place among the powerful. With success came pride, and with pride came a growing sense of superiority. David rarely thought about Mara anymore, but when he did, it was with a quiet assumption that she had fallen behind while he had moved ahead. He believed he had outgrown that chapter of his life completely. Ruth reinforced that belief, often dismissing Mara as part of a past that no longer held relevance. Together, they constructed a narrative where they stood at the top, untouchable and ahead of everyone else. And in that confidence, David began to lose something important: perspective. He no longer questioned his actions or their consequences. To him, success justified everything, and he carried that belief forward without hesitation. The reunion announcement arrived quietly, but its impact was immediate. It was an exclusive alumni gathering, one that brought together individuals who had gone on to achieve influence, success, and recognition in their respective fields. For many, it was a chance to reconnect. For David Jones, it was something else entirely. The moment he saw the invitation, one name stood out to him: Mara Elliott. It had been years since their divorce, years since he had last seen her, yet the thought of her presence stirred something he hadn't expected. Not regret, not longing, but curiosity mixed with a subtle desire to prove something. David didn't hesitate. He confirmed his attendance almost instantly, already envisioning how the evening would unfold. In his mind, it was an opportunity to reinforce the narrative he had built for himself, the man who had risen, evolved, and left behind everything that no longer matched his trajectory. He imagined Mara as she might be now, ordinary, quiet, perhaps still rebuilding. That assumption gave him confidence. It wasn't just about seeing her, it was about being seen by her. About showing, without saying it directly, that he had moved far beyond where they once stood together. When he mentioned the event to Ruth, she immediately understood the underlying intention. She didn't question it, instead, she encouraged it. To her, appearances were powerful, and moments like this were opportunities to solidify status. She began planning their presence with precision: what they would wear, how they would arrive, how they would be perceived. It wasn't just attendance, it was presentation. Together, they shaped a vision of the night where everything would align in their favor. And at the center of it all was a single unspoken goal: to stand in front of Mara Elliott and remind her, without a doubt, of the life she no longer had. In the days leading up to the reunion, David and Ruth treated the event with calculated precision. It was no longer just a gathering, it had become a stage. Ruth took full control of the details, selecting outfits that would command attention without appearing forced. She understood the balance between elegance and dominance, and she ensured that when they entered the room, they would not blend in. David, meanwhile, focused on the narrative he wanted to project: confidence, success, and absolute control over his life. Every detail mattered, from their timing to their interactions, all carefully aligned to create a flawless impression. Their conversations often circled back to Mara, though neither of them framed it as obsession. To David, it was about closure, not emotional closure, but symbolic. He wanted to stand before her as proof that he had made the right choices. Ruth, ever perceptive, understood that this wasn't just about pride, it was about validation. She fed into it subtly, reinforcing the idea that this moment would define how the past was remembered. In her mind, Mara was not a threat, but a reference point, a way to highlight how far David had come. And in doing so, she positioned herself as the clear upgrade. As the day approached, their anticipation grew, not with anxiety, but with certainty. They had constructed an outcome in their minds where everything unfolded exactly as planned. Mara would arrive alone, or at least without anything that could rival their presence. She would see them, understand the difference, and that would be enough. David believed in that outcome completely. What he did not consider was the possibility of unpredictability, the idea that life does not always follow the narratives people create for themselves. And as the night drew closer, that unconsidered possibility waited quietly, ready to change everything. The reunion was held in a grand hall filled with polished marble floors, soft lighting, and conversations that carried both nostalgia and quiet competition. Guests arrived in carefully chosen outfits, each one reflecting years of progress, success, or carefully maintained appearances. David Jones entered with Ruth Johnson exactly as planned, confident, composed, and fully aware of the attention they commanded. Their arrival did not go unnoticed. Heads turned, conversations paused, and subtle admiration followed them as they moved through the room. David acknowledged it all with ease, shaking hands, exchanging brief conversations, fully stepping into the image he had built. For a while, everything unfolded exactly as he expected. He reconnected with familiar faces, accepted compliments, and allowed the evening to reinforce his sense of achievement. Then, quietly, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable, a subtle change in energy, in attention, in focus. Conversations began to slow, eyes turned toward the entrance, and a presence entered the room that carried weight without effort. David noticed it too, though at first he did not understand why. Then he saw her. Mara Elliott walked in with calm, unshaken confidence, but she was not alone. Beside her stood Michael Nathan, the president, composed and unmistakable. There was no announcement, no dramatic introduction, yet their presence altered the entire room. The shift was instant and undeniable. Mara was no longer a figure from the past, she stood at the center of the present, aligned with a level of influence no one had anticipated. David remained. Still, his certainty collapsing in silence. The narrative he had built, the moment he had prepared for, unraveled without a single word being spoken. The room did not erupt into noise, it transformed into something quieter, sharper, and far more revealing. Conversations lowered into whispers, attention redirected completely, and the unspoken hierarchy of the evening shifted in an instant. Where David and Ruth had once stood as the focal point, they now blended into the background of a moment they could no longer control. Mara and Michael moved through the room with composed ease, acknowledging others with calm authority. There was no need to assert presence, it was already established. And that contrast, subtle yet undeniable, was what made the shift so powerful. David felt it before he fully processed it. The glances, the hesitation in conversations, the way people who had once been eager to engage with him were now distracted, drawn elsewhere. He maintained his posture, his expression controlled, but internally, something had fractured. This was not the outcome he had envisioned. He had come prepared to dominate the narrative, to stand as proof of his success. Instead, he found himself standing in the shadow of a reality he had not anticipated. Mara had not only moved forward, she had stepped into a world far beyond what he had imagined for her. Ruth, though composed on the surface, sensed the shift just as clearly. Her confidence remained, but it was no longer supported by control. She observed the room carefully, recognizing that influence had quietly repositioned itself. This was not something she could redirect or outmaneuver in the moment. For the first time, the dynamic she had relied on, presentation, perception, strategic positioning, was no longer enough. And at the center of it all stood Mara, not reacting, not seeking attention, simply existing with a quiet certainty that spoke louder than anything David and Ruth had planned. After the reunion, the shift did not fade, it followed David. What happened that night lingered in conversations, in subtle remarks, in the way people now viewed him. It was never openly discussed, yet it was understood. The narrative he had carefully built around himself, of control, success, and superiority, had been quietly challenged, and that challenge spread faster than he expected. In professional spaces, there was a change. People still respected his achievements, but the certainty around him had weakened. He was no longer the unquestioned figure in the room. There was now comparison, doubt, and a subtle awareness that his story was not as dominant as it once seemed. Ruth noticed it too, and unlike before, she did not try to reinforce his position. She adapted. That was who she was. Where David reacted internally, Ruth recalculated externally. She began creating distance, not abruptly, but gradually, in ways that could not be easily confronted. Fewer appearances together, fewer shared engagements, fewer visible connections. To her, alignment was everything, and she could sense that David's trajectory was no longer as stable as it had been. She did not argue or accuse. She simply shifted her focus elsewhere, preserving her own position while allowing his to weaken without resistance. David, for the first time in a long while, was forced into reflection, not by choice, but by circumstance. The control he believed he had over his image, his life, and his narrative had been disrupted by something he could not predict or undo. Mara's presence at the reunion had not been loud or confrontational, yet it had dismantled something within him. He began to see, slowly and uncomfortably, that success without foundation was fragile. And as the distance between him and Ruth grew, and the silence around him deepened, David was left with something he had long avoided, himself, without distraction, without validation, and without the certainty he once relied on. Mara Elliott did not dwell on the reunion, not because it meant nothing, but because it no longer defined her. What happened that night was not a victory she needed to celebrate, nor a moment she needed to revisit. It was simply confirmation of how far she had come. The life she now lived was not built on comparison or validation, but on clarity and intention. She continued her work with the same quiet discipline, maintaining her independence while standing beside Michael Nathan as an equal, not as a shadow of his position. Their relationship remained private, steady, and grounded, untouched by the noise of public perception. Michael, in his own way, understood what that moment had represented, even without discussion. He saw the strength in Mara's restraint, the way she carried herself without needing acknowledgement. It was one of the many reasons he respected her deeply. Together, they moved forward not as a story to be observed, but as a partnership built on trust. There was no need to prove anything to anyone. What they had was already established, and that certainty allowed them to focus on what truly mattered: their shared values, their responsibilities, and the life they continued to build quietly. As for Mara, her journey had come full circle, not back to where she started, but forward into something stronger. She had experienced love, loss, betrayal, and rebuilding, and through it all, she had remained true to herself. The girl who once sat at a small dining table, believing in effort and integrity, had become a woman who embodied those values fully. And now, standing in a life she had rebuilt from the ground up, she no longer needed to prove her worth. She simply lived it, calm, certain, and free. And that brings us to the end of today's story. The world of luxury often hides stories deeper than what meets the eye. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like, share, and subscribe for more captivating stories on Luxury True Life Stories. Until our next story, take care and stay tuned for more.